well, tonight's lecture is French. I am pleased to say. Start with a quote from General de Gaulle, and if we had all gone to school in France, we would know this quote by heart. As all my life, I have thought of France in a certain way. This is inspired by my sentiments as much by reason. The emotional side of me tends to imagine France like a princess in the fairy stories or the Madonna in the frescoes, as dedicated to an exalted, exceptional destiny. Instinctively, I have the feeling that Providence has created her either for complete successes or for exemplary misfortunes. If, in spite of this mediocrity shows in her acts and deeds, it strikes me as an absurd anomaly to be imputed to the faults of Frenchmen, not to the genius of the land. But the positive side of my mind also assures me that France is not really herself unless in the front rank, that only vast enterprises are capable of counterbalancing the ferments of dispersal which are inherent in her people, that our country, as it is surrounded by others, as they are, must aim high and hold itself straight on pain of mortal danger. In short, to my mind, France cannot be France without greatness. This is the opening paragraph of his memoirs on France. Very famous, like I said. If we had gone to school in France, we would know that immediately. What is the greatness of France? This is the question, one of the things I want to think about today. If you read the history books, the standard story is France is big, it's populous. In the Middle Ages, it was one of the wealthiest countries going, and certainly during the reign of the Louis, sort of Louis XI through Louis XVI, it was doing very well indeed. But at other points of history, it was a wreck. It was divided by civil war, overrun by all kinds of foreign invaders. So that can't be entirely correct, certainly part of it. Another thing, if you look at the map of France, I'll give you a map, we'll refer to this several times. France is in the middle of things. France is very much like Poland, and so French history is very much like Polish history in the sense that the boundaries move all the time, they get invaded all the time, they invade the other way all the time. And so the geography of France is incredibly malleable. There's really the notion that this is France, is better to say this is France for the moment. In 20 years, France may look very different again, because about every 20 years for most of its history, the borders were moving. Incredibly malleable. In the United States, we sort of set our east coast and then went west. And that's sort of the United States, those boundaries. But in France, it can go down towards Spain, it can move towards Italy, it can go up towards Belgium, the Benelux countries, right? So all of this has always been very squishy with France. So this is not quite right either. I think, and the argument I'm going to make is the greatness of France, what France is the French language. To a degree that I can find no comparable country in history. France equals French. To understand France, you must understand the French language, because this is really what France is all about. And we'll spend some time on that. Just to give you an example of how influential this is, when I was in graduate school not that many years ago, who were we reading? So it's a big world, lots of thinkers, all kinds of American thinkers, German, Italian, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Now, Paul de Man, Helen Cecil, Gilles Deleuze, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, Julia Kristeva, Ferdinand de Saussure. That's just off the top of my head. I just made a list real quick. Who were we studying? French. How is that possible? How is it, given the entire world, and plus we're in America, not all that outward looking, with the most influential cultural and intellectual ideas of the late 20th century be coming from one country, again, from France? Again, it's because part of the genius of France, part of the greatness of France, and really much of the identity of France, is the language. So French, think of it this way, it's very important. So where does this begin? Well, it starts with sort of everything else, with the Romans rolling into Gaul. And they've been having sort of disagreements with the Gauls for a long time. If you're familiar with the name Vercingetorix, He was probably the greatest of the Gaulish leaders, and he got crushed, and that sort of destroyed their program. And so the Romans in around 50-ish AD set up shop in a territory roughly equivalent to what we would say is modern France, sort of more towards the north around the Paris, Ile-de-France area, but spreading out. And they were there for about 400 years. But they were settled. And as happens, you start to get language drift. Because as you get slightly disconnected from Rome, the influences of the native languages and just the distances involved, Latin started to change. Then Rome collapses. Cut off from Rome. And now the change really sets in. A few hundred years later, you already have an identifiably different language. These are called the Romance languages, of course, but they're beginning to drift. Frankish, or all these sorts of names for it. By the time you get, and by the way, the intervening years, I'll have to skip over a lot of this, obviously, because it goes fast, but you've got the Merovingians. Think of them sort of as a whole bunch of Caligula's gone wrong. I mean, these were really, this was not a pleasant bunch of people to have running anything. They were a nasty, nasty, brutish, vicious set of people. You get the Carolingian dynasty, which is where we get Charlemagne. If you're familiar with Charlemagne, this is where he comes from. And this is during Charlemagne's reign, by the way, when you get an edict that says you have to use this kind of Latin in Latin documents. It becomes sort of church Latin. The reason they had to fix it is because it was getting so transmogrified into what we would now call sort of Middle French, the French of the Middle Ages. No one knows exactly what Charlemagne spoke. He wasn't literate, but no one knows exactly what he spoke. But all the guess is he spoke some sort of medieval French. And so this is where you really begin to see the division. Well, then the Carolingian thing falls apart. And this is why I said where France is, God only knows. Because when the Carolingian Empire falls apart, you have this idea that you could have this big, expansive territory, but nobody's able to pull it off. And so it rises and falls. And about 9/11 is an important date, just picking one of these. Out of Norway, the Vikings come. The Norsemen descend all over Europe. And they sack Paris several times. They ruin the countryside. They're invading all over the place. This is still somewhat of a mystery exactly what's going on with all that. But in 9/11, Paris is being attacked again by this huge Viking army. And the Comte de Paris, amazingly enough, says, no, we're not surrendering. We're not going to just let them overrun us. We're going to hold in the Ile-de-City, which is the island in the middle of Paris. We're going to hold out here in this fortress. And we're going to stand against them. And they do. And they eventually negotiate this treaty where they say, you know what? Why don't you guys settle in Normandy and look over there. If you look they've got a lot of money over there. They've got all this nice stuff. We think you should settle here and look that way. And this is exactly what happens. And so we have this interesting, and so the Comte de Paris is then, after this works, they like, you're the man, so they elect him King of France, right? So he's one of these early King of France. At that time, he controlled a region roughly the size of this room. So he was the king of everything he could see from the top of the highest building in the center of Paris, right? I mean, it was not a big thing, but he begins to expand out again. But of course, then you get the Norman invasions about 200 years later into England. Now what's curious about this is these are the same Normans who just got transplanted. Right? So they're in Normandy, but they're not like native Gaelic French people. They're Norwegians, and they did a lot of trade, a lot of contact back there. But about 150 years, 200 years of hanging out in Normandy, and they acquire French. And so they invade England, which made the French very happy indeed, because they're like, goodbye, yes, go conquer those people. That's what trouble could that possibly cause, is what they're right? Well, if we fast forward about 200 years again to the 12th century, I'm sort of rounding these numbers off. If you fast forward to the 12th century, trouble in fact comes back. In fact, the 12th century is key for three reasons here. First, you get the official founding of the University of Paris. And to understand France and French, you must understand the University of Paris. It's officially founded, I think it's like 1176. They get an edict from the Pope that says, yes, you can be a university. But it had been in operation before. But now it's official. Why does this matter? One, France, or Paris, is a long ways from Rome. They got their charter from somebody who couldn't supervise them. As we all know, this is the way to work. A long ways from your supervisors. And so if you were in Rome and trying to operate colleges, which they had sort of schools and such things are forming also in Rome and in Spain, but they're very much closer to the governing authorities. Paris, far away. Much more liberty. And this was commented on at the time. People went to Paris, they said, wow, it's everything people say about Paris now. Beautiful, amazing, rich, lovely, and free. And so all the best thinkers, or many of the best thinkers of Europe, start migrating to Paris and to the University of Paris. The Sorbonne, this is the kickoff. This is several hundred years before Oxford and Cambridge are even thought about. And this does two things. One, of course, you're there, you're learning Latin, but you're living for years in Paris, so you also learn French. And you learn Parisian French, which we'll see in a moment is very important. So all of the key thinkers who are going back to all the capitals of Europe come back speaking Parisian French. This is the kind of French they speak, and it's a second major language for them. And they associate it basically with all the good times you can have in Paris. So it's the language of joie de vivre already. It begins to be referenced to this. The joy, the freedom, the beauty, the loveliness. The Latin is what we learned in class. The French is what we learned, in the bars and the brothels. This is what, that's a big difference. One has very positive associations. One does not. I'll let you work out which is which. And so this is in the 12th century. Until today, that influence has continued. The reason I'm learning, Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, in graduate school in the 20th century in America is because of the university system in France. I mean, it's 900 years later, still going strong. Still turning out world-beating intellectuals. And this continuous production. It was influential then. Thomas Becket, by the way, writes about this famous English thinker, right? Where did he go? University of Paris. He's like, wow, this place is incredible. Blew his mind in 1192, right around that. Might not be the exact date, but it's right around there. Writing to his friends, going, oh, you've got to come to Paris. It's the place to be. Second important thing in the 12th century is Henry II rolls in. So what could possibly go wrong with sending the Normans off into England? Turns out Henry II, who conquers essentially everything. If you look at the map again, right around Paris, it didn't show up too well. It's supposed to be a little bright spot there called the Ile-de-France. And it's sort of a district around Paris. Essentially, that is the only thing he hadn't really conquered. He destroyed everything. It's all taken. So now this is the Anglo-Saxon Norman re-invasion of France. So this moment of teetering on the brink where, it could go extinct. Oh, no it can't. Why? Henry II spoke French. Not only did he speak French, he spoke Parisian French because they imported people from Paris to teach him to speak French in the courts of England. For another 300 years-ish, French is the official court language in England. Chaucer writes about this. He has passages where he talks about the quality of the French of the various people who were on tour with him. Because the better your French, the higher rank you were. And of course, the rule is always Paris. Again, Chaucer refers to this specifically in several passages. Particularly when he's talking about the prioress, whose French is not that good because she's never been to Paris. Right? And so it's this weird moment where the territorial integrity of what you would call France has been completely overrun by these foreigners you would call the English now, except for they speak French, and plus they were from France originally. Anyway, what the hell is going on? I don't know. So this is why I say the territorial integrity of France, military power at this point is give or take zero. So yeah, it's hard to figure out what that means. But it's this interesting moment where France was almost conquered by French-speaking peoples from France. Right? This is like the magic of France. I don't know how that works, but it works. So fast forward, this gets turned around. The area around Paris expands again. France becomes sort of ruled by the French. And then in 1539, one more thing in the 12th century, you get the beginning of French literary influence. Another amazing moment. You have the story of the Rose, the Romance of the Rose, which was influential all over Europe. It's written in the 12th century. Also, the Arthurian legends, the founding legends of Anglo-Saxon Britain, come at least half, probably 3/4 from France. Lancelot, that's the French invention. The Grail, totally from France. Fisher King, that's from France. All of these elements that we think, these are the Anglo-Saxon. No. In fact, it may be more than 3/4 of them. It's a very difficult scholarly question, but it's no problem to say half. It's probably a lot more of that myth actually came from French and French poems and French stories being imported into the Anglo-Saxon country rather than the other way around. And so the sort of founding Anglo-Saxon myths of England are largely, or at least in a good deal, from France again. So the influence of their literature is already in the 12th century pouring forward. Easy to forget this and lose track of it, but it's already underway. So then you fast forward to 1539. King Francis I puts out an edict. And this edict says all documents in the government will be written in French. The French of Paris. Parisian French. Now this is upsetting because in France of the time you have Provençal, which is a version of French. You have Breton, which is a totally different thing entirely. You have this very wide diversity of languages being spoken. But he says, no, this is the language, this is the official language, this is how it's going to be written, this is how it's going to be used. By the way, this is, again, not only just early, this is almost unique. We've never done anything like that in the United States. There is no official version of English. We say, we want to, people say, we should be English first country. That's great. Well, what do you mean by English? How should it be written? What are the rules? We have all these different groups that fight about this, but we've never had the edict, the organization, that says this is it. So even before that, but from 1539 on, French is officially focus of the government, not the language, but how the language is used, becomes a central issue in laws, communication. If you want to get anything done in Paris, you have to use the correct language in the courts, everything. Standardized very early. Extremely early. And then in 1635, to make sure you didn't miss the point, you get the Académie Française, which is an academy set up to immortalize, essentially, the French language, to protect it, to regulate it, to solve linguistic disputes, to protect it from foreign interlopers. With the rise of America, by the way, in the 20th century, this became a huge problem because they eventually had to approve things like les blue jeans. Right? Because everybody was using it and they didn't want to approve it, but they couldn't resist. So they would come up with French equivalents for all these words and people would just ignore them. Then finally the Academy would say, all right, you can use les blue jeans. But they resist this, they fight this. But this institution is still going strong, by the way. So now we're 400-ish years later. And the Academy is still functioning. And the primary function of the Academy is make sure the French language is strong and pure and based on a specific version of the French language. And that everybody speaks it. So again, hundreds of years ago, the idea of France is focused on the language, French. This is what it means to be French. The Académie Française tells you what it means to be French. It means to speak in this way and to use language in this way. In a way that almost the only closest thing I can come up with is the Chinese and the Confucius classics. You learned a particular kind of Chinese, and that's what organized them and gave them coherence. So also around 1635, again, these dates rough, Académie Française definitely founded in 1635, but the French becomes the official diplomatic language. And so that lasts for almost 400 years, by the way. So from about mid-1600s until World War I. At the end of World War I, England and America insisted that the negotiations at the end of the Paris Peace Treaty, although it was in Paris, oddly enough, be held in English. Because by God, Wilson wasn't going to learn French, right? I mean, this is essentially what it amounted to. And so that was the end of France as the official diplomatic language of the world. To a remarkable degree. So there's a 400-year run. Where does France get its influence from? Where does it get its power from? In part, just from everybody in the world wanting to communicate in French. Extraordinary achievement. There's no good reason for this, by the way. Again, it just, people wanted to identify with French and wanted to speak French. And so it became a de facto great language to work with. That takes us roughly to the 20th century. Obviously, I've sort of skated over a few issues and events. So you get World War II. You may have heard of it. It's a big party. France is conquered sort of rapidly. Again, certainly not military glory that de Gaulle could be talking about. The greatness couldn't be particularly military in that instance. Occupied, destroyed, overrun, and so liberated by the Allies with the French assistance. And so France sinks into what? Second world, third world status? No. Why would they? UN Security Council is China. That makes sense. US. That makes sense. We won the war. China's huge. And was at that time our ally. Russia, then the Soviet Union. That makes sense. They also sort of won the war. Well, they lost it and won it, I would say. England, because our ally, and that was the other ally that won the war, and France. Today, France has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Only 5 nations. One of them is France. What? How did they pull that off? I mean, they were resoundingly defeated and then liberated, which is fine, and then they end up with a permanent seat on the Security Council. If you look at the European Union of today has 23 official languages. Having 23 official languages is exactly the same thing as having no official language. So there's right, everybody clear on this, that you can't do business in 23 official languages, so they have no official language. Where are the headquarters of the European Union? Brussels, where they speak French. Strasbourg, where they speak French. Right? And Geneva, where they speak, French. Again, wow, how did that happen? Right? There's this huge influence of French again. And so a lot of English is used in the European Union. So this is not to say that French is the dominant language by any extent, but it is a hugely influential language for the French. And so this cultural influence continues. And so when the idea of the greatness of France, you say, well, how great could this be? And so that's why I put the back of your program there. This is my summary. Why is France influential? Why is French the language influential? Why does it continue to be influential today? Well, look at this run. Again, this is just a briefest of lists. The Middle Ages, again, you got the Song of Roland, which if you know anything, you may have heard of that if you're at all interested in medieval literature. Lancelot the Knight, which again is the foundation, one of the foundations of the Arthurian legends. Romance of the Rose is sort of the 12th century bestseller. Everybody was interested in it. Everybody liked it. It maintains influence today. Then you get Rabelais in the 16th century, Gargantua and Pantagruel, and then you get Montaigne. Again, I mentioned Montaigne in Latin because he had this bizarre upbringing where he was trained in Latin. His family didn't let him have any contact with native speakers. All the servants were trained to speak Latin, and his parents only spoke to him in Latin. Classical Latin. Roman, 4th century Roman Latin. And so he was one of the last people raised in Rome of the 4th century. And so his Latin was perfect. But when Montaigne went to write his essays, his memoir sort of thoughts, he wrote in French, even though Latin was in fact his first language and was the language of scholarship. Why would he do that? Because already, at this time, French is recognized as that significant of a language. It's sufficiently advanced, sufficiently important, sufficiently influential that you want to express yourself in French. And he did, and was hugely influential on the rest of European literature because of that. By the way, to be literate in France today is to have read Montaigne 100 times. This is, if you want to know how to write well in French and why French is different from English, their whole structure of their essay, the whole way they produce writing, is Montaigne, Montaigne, Montaigne. It is different, and much of the beauty comes from his thought. Lafayette, Pascal, and then the second one, Blaise Pascal, La Pensée. The Pensées, it's just, that's the second probably. With Montaigne, this is the other thing. You think like Pascal and you write like Montaigne. If you can do that off, you will win all of the French literary prizes, right? This is the key. You can pull it off. Pascal, Rochefort, Corneille, Molière, Racine. I mean, Corneille, Molière, Racine. How's that for a triple header, right? Those are your starting lineup of playwrights. You're going to do all right. Provost, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot. How's that? That's pretty good, right? Just 1, 2, 3 there. Marquis de Sade. Wow, only France could produce him. What a great guy. Rousseau, de Tocqueville. If anybody hasn't read de Tocqueville, you want to know anything about America, read de Tocqueville. He basically, he has a lot, not all of it right, but boy, did he get a lot of it right. Marvaux, Beaumarchais. I don't even know. You just read through Chateaubriand, Stendhal, Balzac, Dumas, Victor Hugo, Jules Verne, the Goncourt brothers, Mapallant, Zola, Michelet, André Gide, Proust, Breton, Leroux, Céline, Colette. I mean, every century, France has not produced 1 or 2 world-class thinkers who influenced the writers, literate writers all over whatever the sphere of the reach of European letters. They produced 5 or 10. I mean, it's almost unimaginable, this unceasing flow of greatness and literary and philosophical thought. There's no equivalent like this, basically in other languages. The closest equivalent I come back to is Greek, where you just get this unending series of incredibly powerful thinkers, so that everybody who wanted to be literate wanted to read the Greek material, because look at this, just for 250, 300 years, they produced thinker after thinker after thinker after thinker. Well, this is what happened with France. If they had culturally dried up and everybody had soft spots, well, everybody would ignore them. Eventually you go, well, why bother learning France? They're not that significant anymore. But again, look at this list. How many people have heard of Jean-Paul Sartre? Right? Or Proust. How many people have heard of Proust? Think about this. One of the most influential novels of the 20th century was written by a guy who not only rarely left Paris, but rarely left his bedroom. This is in a French that's so impenetrable that French people can't read it, and yet here it is. I looked up the Nobel Prizes for the 20th century. Well, since Nobel Prize has been given, and 19 French folks have won the Nobel Prize, which is hugely overrepresentative of French speakers. 8 Americans have. Actually, they claim more than that, but several of the Americans who have won were actually from Eastern Europe, like Czesław Miłosz. Yeah, he won when he was living in America. He was not an American writer. There's no way you can call him an American writer. And so it's this strange world that we live in, where You are probably, how many people here have studied French at one point or another, right? Look at that, yeah. So there's about 3/4 of the people here have actually studied French. Why? Population-wise, it's not a huge country. Militarily, it's third tier of military power. Certainly not significant there. Geographically, trade-wise, it's actually a very large part of European trade, but it's not a huge trade partner with the United States. Canada and Mexico, by the way, much larger trade partners than France is with the United States. So why have we all learned French? Why have we all studied French? Why have we haven't studied French? We've probably heard of many, many, many of these authors. This incredible cultural richness that's built around specifically the French language, the belles arts. So I want to stop and think of a few of the examples of where this influence has come from and what it's meant to us, and sort of then wrap up with maybe where we are today. The difference between French and Latin is primarily twofold. One, now I've got to get this right. Did I write it down? Well, here we go. We'll see if I get my Latin. Oh, no, I did write it down. Good. It's better if I get it right. Sorry. Wrong word. So, je vois, tu vois, et vois. This is French to see, or to view. Right? Notice the ending here is the same. In Latin, this would be vidi, vidisti, vidi. This ending, it, isti, and e, identifies who's doing it. So vidi means I see, vidisti, you see, vidit, she, it sees. In Latin, you do not need this identifier, which means that this can go anywhere in a sentence. And so word order in Latin tend to be moderately loose, certainly much looser than it is in French. In French, these endings are simplified. Many, many, many of them just dropped, as you see here. Conversely, this requires the use of more pronouns and much tighter sentence structure. So this is step one to understand. This is why it's not Latin anymore. Second, they dropped all kinds of vowel and consonant sounds. This is why you can't pronounce French, because they speak poorly. This is the problem. No, they dramatically altered the way Latin was pronounced. Once you learn, I wish we had time to go through this, but once you learn those pronunciation changes, it's very simple to immediately recognize French-Latin words, right? It's no problem at all. Because you go, oh, the ST has dropped to an E sound or U sound, right? And so when you get that sound, you go, oh, that's from the Latin this, which means, oh, that's what that word is. So it gives you this very direct connection. So the vocabulary in French is still largely, it's direct from Latin. Hence, vidi and voir not that far off. But pronunciation and word order changed pretty dramatically over time. And so this is where they shifted. And this introduces all kinds of different influences. But once you lose these endings, notice we don't have these endings in English either. Or we have almost none of them. I mean, this is quite... And so many, many, many of the words that come to English from the Middle French, which is from Latin, are simply the French or Latin roots that have dropped the endings. So voir is where we get our word voyeur. Okay? This is just a direct importation of the French word that comes from the Latin. And so when we eventually get to English, we'll talk about the huge influence that French has had, particularly on our vocabulary. So one reason that the French language remains sort of hugely influential, in part, is because it is a vast part of the English language. If anybody ever asks you, do you know what the root of that word is? Just say medieval French. That comes from the medieval French. Because statistically speaking, you're right. I mean, factually speaking, you probably don't want to just do that. But statistically, you'll get it right because, vast numbers come from medieval French. This is where we get the language from. Also introduces all kinds of interesting things. What is the difference between swine and pork? Great, I love this. Notice, watch this. So swine we don't use so much anymore. We use pig, but we still have the notion of swine. A swine is the animal out in the field. Low-class worker, swine herd. No good, right? When you eat it, it's pork. At the table, high class. Food, good. French word, Anglo-Saxon word. This happens over and over and over again. The Anglo-Saxon word comes to be associated with the mucky bits, and French comes to be associated with the good bits. So the pork is good, the swine is bad. Pork is French, swine is Anglo-Saxon. You do the same thing with sheep and mutton. It goes on and on. This is a consistent pattern to our language because of this mix between the Anglo-Saxon, of course, and the French with the Norman invasion, as we spoke about. So another reason, again, it's influential, like I said, is because of all of this vocabulary that comes over quite directly. And anybody who reads literature should recognize this immediately. Second huge influence is intellectual. Again, as I mentioned, for several hundred years, France has been turning out world-class philosophers. And when you look at, so for instance, our founding fathers, when they weren't reading the Greek and Roman classics, who were they reading? What languages were they reading in? French. One of the key languages. Jefferson is an ambassador to France. He arrives in France ready to go because, of course, he would have known French. He's supervising the education of his daughter. One of the most important things was her French. He has one of them sent over with him so she can get French firsthand. So our founding ideas, the intellectual content of our country, again, like the Latin and Roman classics, a lot of it also comes to us from the French. Very different sense of existence. Some of our struggle actually comes from the fact, again, that some of the French ideas don't line up so well with our Anglo-Saxon ideas. And they continue to have this trouble. But next, think about this. The French Revolution. Right? Why was this such a huge event in world history? The American Revolution was a big and interesting event. It was nothing compared to the French Revolution. The transformation that was wrought both by getting rid of the ancient regime and then by the sort of Napoleon, like I said, the great builder and great terror downer that was Napoleon, that he sort of just cleans the slate with things, upset all of Europe. And everybody consistently said what was most upsetting was the idea. Why do we have to fight France? Because of the idea that you can live without a king. Why do we have to fight France? Because of the idea of the nation state that they're bringing to the fore. Why did everybody know this idea? How did it spread so rapidly? Why was it such a powerful example? Because everybody in every court in Europe spoke French. If it had been the Polish Revolution or the Czech Revolution, people would have gone, might not have even heard about it for a long time. If they did hear about it, they would have heard about it in French. No, I'm serious. They would have heard about it in French. But the French Revolution is a revolution that communicated with everybody instantaneously. And so this was danger, and it was hugely important. And read the material from the time. Nobody was confused about this. All of the other leaders said, we cannot allow France to set the example that you can get rid of a czar, that you can get rid of a king, that you can get rid of an emperor. We must destroy it. And so the history of the Napoleonic era is coalitions of countries attacking France to try and stop Napoleon, and Napoleon defeating them, and then overstretching and deciding he wants to take everything, and then he would be defeated, and then there would be peace for a couple of minutes, and then they would coalition with for you, and they just did this over and over and over again until, of course, inevitably Napoleon loses, because he was just destined to lose. I mean, you can only do that for so long. But the key notion is not just the military struggle; it was an intellectual struggle for this idea. And once the revolution happened, that was it. There was no putting that genie back in the bottle because, again, everybody knew. Notice that democracy wasn't new. We had democracy in America, and England had a sort of, whatever their version of parliamentary loose democracy was. So this was not the threat. We tend to think, the rise of democracy. No, France had just got up and said, we'll have a parliamentary democracy, and we'll have a council that advises the king. And no one would have cared. But the revolutionary ideas that were spread. Another element is the encyclopedists. We've lost track of this, but it was this movement to try and collate all knowledge into one place, an encyclopedia, right? And so the people who were working on this were called the encyclopedists. Leading minds mostly, almost entirely, of the French intellectual world. Think of it as it's almost like the contemporary internet. Because if you wanted to look up something before the encyclopedists worked, you probably needed a pretty large library or an access to it. And this is a time when books are still pretty expensive. And the kinds of reference works that these people were using were wildly expensive and extraordinarily rare. And so they came up with the idea, notice this, is to say, look, we want to make all of this information available to as many people as possible and disseminate it as widely as possible. Again, a revolutionary idea that had literally revolutionary implications. It was sort of this strange version of sort of an internet database of the time, kind of a Wikipedia, if you will, as if Wikipedia was written by brilliant, incredibly literate people. But this idea that then you could look things up, and it's great to flip through these, because if you look up look up the definition of a king, right? It wasn't that flattering, right? So it definitely had its slant on what was going on. But again, why was this dangerous? Why was it influential? Why did everybody subscribe to it? Because it was in French. Other languages, Germany couldn't have done this. People would have shrugged their shoulders and said, who cares? Two more examples here to tell the ongoing influence. When Voltaire was in Paris, he always got in trouble. And he got in trouble because he was always writing tracts against the Dauphin or the king, or whoever was around to make fun of. And so at one point he gets imprisoned in the Bastille, a couple of times he went to the Bastille. And he comes out of the Bastille, and he immediately is awarded a prize, a big gold medal, but you melted the gold down for money. So it was they gave him a gold prize. And they said, okay, you just released him from the Bastille for writing these plays and stories that mock the government. Why are you going to give him an award? Like, he's the same guy who had imprisoned him, by the way. This is not somebody else. He's like, he's a really good writer. I mean, it's Voltaire. It's true. And like 6 months later, he put a writ out for Voltaire's arrest because Voltaire, of course, just kept going on doing. And Voltaire had to flee Paris for a while. He lived as an exile and finally was able to worm his way back in. They said, we'll let him in, and we'll give him some more money, and we'll give him a permit to put his plays on. Why? And then what did they do? They tried to arrest him and they just did this cycle over and over. And on the outside, you read this, you go, this is just crazy. How many times can you arrest somebody for sedition and saying that the king is a bastard and all these sorts of things, and give him money and literary prizes? It turns out over and over and over and over again. At one point, they were calling to arrest Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre was under threat of being arrested. And de Gaulle, they said, to go to Gaulle, left-wing radicals, Charles de Gaulle will never be mistaken for a left-wing radical. And they said, we want to arrest Sartre. And they said, well, let's do it. And de Gaulle said, no. And they said, why not? And he says, because France does not put Voltaire in prison. Which is not true, in fact, because they did put Voltaire. Right? They did it over and over. They did it like 5 times. But they always let him out and gave him money. And sometimes they gave him prizes basically while he was in prison for sedition. Right? So it's almost unimaginable for America. Because imagine this. If we wanted to arrest somebody for something, crime against the government, and your defense was, I'm a really good writer. I'm a spectacular writer. I'm like the greatest writer of my generation. They'd be like, okay, you're going to jail. Right? They're not going to let you off easy because you're a great writer. In France, this is, again, Voltaire is just the most famous example, but this hesitancy, there would be occasional crackdowns and everybody go, well, we don't know, we feel bad about cracking down. This love of their own culture and belief in, again, the culture, the greatness of their own. Not that other people are bad, not that other people are second rate, but our culture is great. World War II is about to kick off. Everybody knows cities are going to be bombed. So Berlin, fallout shelters. London, fallout shelters. Paris, underground cafes and theaters. The government started a project of building underground cafes and theaters so that when the city was bombed, you could still go to the theater. Because you want to see Racine, you want to see Molière, you want to see The Marriage of Figaro. Right? You want to see this stuff because it's good. And it's what France is. And so that's what you build the barricades around. I mean, one reason, it's sort of this tragic moment in French history when they just give up and they don't want to fight in Paris. The government of France says, no, the Germans are going to win. Let's not defend Paris. Why not? Because it'll get blown up. It'll mess the place up. There's a great passage in one of Proust's letters where they can hear in the distance the bombing. This World War I, not II in this case, of course, and you can hear the shells in the distance. That's how close the Germans got to Paris. And he walks outside at night, and which again, he wasn't a big one for leaving his room at this point. And the starlight is out, and the moon is full, and he said, it's quiet. In the distance I can hear the shelling. And I was surrounded by all this useless beauty. And I couldn't help but weep. Because I thought, it's about to get destroyed. All of this useless beauty. But I would argue that it is precisely the useless beauty that is and has been and continues to be the greatness of France. In the arts, sculpture, music, Debussy, it goes on and on. Painting, we'll just mention the Impressionist movement, and it would be good if that's all you had, but obviously that's not all they had. Right? But it is, first and foremost, simply the greatness of the French language that has carried sort of the tricolors before the tricolors existed. For 1,000 years. Again, go back. It's great moments where I want to start with the 12th century there. France is under siege. The political and geographic territory of the country is being overrun by Anglo-Saxon invaders who speak French. It's just the strangest moment. That even if they had lost, it's pretty clear that French would have won. That the language would have continued. France was one of the losers of World War II. It ended up being allied on the right side, but it lost, basically all of its prestige. Its economy was gutted. Its empire was rapidly dismantled. And so what are you left with? Why is France still a great power? How many of us have read all the Polish classics? There's some great Polish literature. There really is. Even the Russian literature, outside of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin, beautiful material rarely gets out. By the way, just a note, the opening of War and Peace is in French. You may not know this if you don't read Russian, because usually in the English versions it's translated into English. But the actual opening of War and Peace is not in Russian, it's in French. Because, of course, Tolstoy knew French, and he knew that the people who were speaking would have been speaking French. So this dramatic and continuing influence, so again, brings us right till today. France is the 5th largest economy in the world, give or take, 5th or 6th. It comes in, but let's just say 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. So do anybody think of them as an economic powerhouse? No, we just don't. I just can't have a hard time wrapping my mind around the fact that France is this just economic powerhouse, 5th largest economy in the world. China, United States, Japan, Germany, France. And if they can pass Germany, they're going to be so happy, by the way. They want to pass Germany. But the 5th largest economy in the world. When you think Germany, you think economy. You think China, you think economy. You think Japan, you think economy. You think France, you think, cheese. Right? Isn't that right? The French cheese. How big and powerful could they possibly be? So that, and then we also lose track of the fact that the French is spread all over the world. If you account the foreign speakers of French, French is probably the 4th or 5th most spoken language in the world. A lot of this depends on how you count and how you score. Maybe 6th, but could be as high as 4th, could be as low as 6th. Because we forget things like Quebec in Canada. What is this why is Quebec different from the rest of Canada? They speak French. Think about that. How strange that is. Imagine we had one state where they spoke Spanish. And that was the whole raison d'etre of the state. We're going to call it California soon. But this is the idea. Right? I believe it's true now, but I know for a long time in Quebec, they encouraged French speakers from all over the world to immigrate in. So it didn't matter how poor you were. If you're from Tunisia, some back village in Tunisia, incredibly poor. No, we want you. At the same time, British Columbia had this policy of saying, if you have $1 million in liquid assets, we'll let you immigrate. Yeah. So they had this immigration from Asia. They called them the yacht people. Right? Because all these super wealthy Asians were showing up. See, that makes sense to us. You have $1 million, you immigrate, you help our economy, we love you. It makes no sense to us to say, we don't care how dirt poor you are. We don't care what your religion is. We don't care. If you speak French, we will let you immigrate. We encourage you, we will help you immigrate to Quebec. Because we love the French speakers. Talk to anybody who's traveled in the Caribbean. The former French islands are completely different than the former British colonies. Many of them still speak French. A country like Tunisia just had a revolution. Essentially a 100% Arab country. Essentially 100% Muslim. They all go to school in French. Why? Because they think it's a great language. That's basically, they identify it very strongly with literature, culture, European ideals, greatness. Cultural richness, riches, the good life is French. So think about this in our own imagination. Think of the place it occupies. If you think of France, again, you don't think economic powerhouse, you don't think military powerhouse. So why do we think of it at all? Who cares? There's a lot of countries in the world that we don't, who cares? Uzbekistan. Why would we even think of Uzbekistan? Right? Ecuador. That's a fine country. We never think of that. But France occupies this huge intellectual space. And my argument, to wrap up, is essentially that is the greatness of France. That somehow, some way, through the magic medium of the French language, it has managed to occupy this very large part of the intellectual space of thinking peoples for 800 years. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, the French language.